The Limits of Institutional Reform in Development chronicles stories of attempts to build and rebuild governments in developing countries over the last 30 years. These attempts generally try to change the rules of the game within governments and between governments and societies. What the book shows is that many of these attempts don't do what we hope that they will do. They don't lead to more functional states. They don't lead to governments that manage their money better or manage their people better or engage in a more fruitful manner with business. They don't necessarily lead to governments that are less corrupt than they were when they began. Instead, they often lead to governments that look a lot better than they did when they started. Their laws are better, their organizations are better, they have better regulations and procedures and systems, sometimes costing hundreds of millions of dollars. But in many cases, these laws and systems and procedures don't work. They aren't implemented, they aren't adhered to, and they simply become like window dressing on a store that doesn't really function or sell what you really hope it does. So what the book does is it goes into an explanation of why this seems to be the case, using a fair amount of data, some case studies, and a lot of empirical evidence to try and really make a strong case. It says that a lot of countries have a huge incentive to signal with the reforms that they use. This means that they do all the things that the international donors tell them to do. And this is really useful for them because the donors have very strong ideas about what should be done. Whether you're talking about public financial management or civil service reform or anti-corruption, there are usually very, very fixed agendas that donors have agreed to. These fixed agendas are assessed in indicators that governments will essentially model their reforms around. The problem is that these solution sets don't necessarily take into consideration the contexts that you are trying to do the reform in. They impose content that is really beyond the means of many countries. And they don't necessarily engage broadly with the agents on the ground who have to make the change happen. Now, what the book also does is it identifies a subset of experiences where we see reform being more successful, where governments decentralize, and they actually find that decentralized agencies produce services better than they did before. Or where governments try to tackle corruption and they find that they actually can tackle corruption afterwards. Or where governments try to overhaul their health services and the product is better healthcare. And what we find there is a completely different model of intervention. It doesn't start with solutions, but it starts with problems. It doesn't progress along a standard reform process whereby you have a project and the project has to be implemented in just such a manner. Rather, it's incremental, step by step. There's a lot of experimentation and there's a lot of learning and there's a lot of flexibility. We also find in these cases that it's not about having one single champion running the reform. It's about having a group of agents who bring a lot of different roles and functions to bear to make a solution that works for the country where it is being introduced. So this is where the book ends up with a proposal for international development, not to use a standard project approach in doing institutional reforms, but to adopt what is called problem-driven iterative adaptation. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the basic idea is do the reforms that work in the context, that solve the problems that people there care about, that emerge from iterative processes of finding and fitting solutions that can actually work in those contexts, and that involve many agents so that you can actually diffuse and you can actually sustain the interventions you put in place. I leave the book at the end with the question of whether this kind of approach is even possible in the development community. This community is a community that has withstood change for many generations now. But we also do think that there are signs that there might be some openings for adjustments in the process and the approach to change. That's what the book is about. I hope that you enjoy reading it or at least have enjoyed listening to me talking about it. Thank you.